The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome back to the third in our three webinars focused on developmental education practices, a call to action for 2019. This is Jenny Shanker from the Michigan Center for Student Success. Happy to have many of you with us. I know that a number of you have been with us this morning for our previous two webinars with Alexandra Logue and Peter Adams. Just a quick reminder, if you were not here, that there is a question pane in your control panel where you are able to enter your questions. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll let John know if we need to pause and address any questions. John's also welcome to pause and ask for questions at spots that make sense in his presentation. And so without further ado, and then stay on the line at the end. We'll have many of our panelists are with us and might be able to answer more questions about not only John's presentation, but also anything that happened previously that you didn't get to ask or that you are thinking about. So without further ado, I'm happy to have John Hetz available, the Senior Director of Data Science at EdResults and the Educational Results Partnership, and he's going to talk about how we can let Icarus fly.
Hi, I guess this is good afternoon for all of you. Good morning from California. Excited to talk to you about all of this. I have a lot to share. And so some of it I'm going to go through relatively quickly. I know people had questions about the slides. One of the things that you can do right away is you have access to the slides that I'm going to present. All of them are right there at that address that I've highlighted, bit.ly/IcarusMI with Michigan MI in capital letters. You also have access to my email address, and if you do Twitter, I do Twitter occasionally. I'm kind of like the Das Equis of Twitter when it comes to DevEd. I don't tweet very often, but when I do, it's going to be about developmental education and multiple measures. So I like to start with the story of Icarus. And Icarus, many of you are probably familiar with the myth. I borrowed this from Seth Godin. It's a really interesting myth that's very relevant for what we talk about with respect to students. And so the Icarus was the son of Daedalus, a fabulous inventor, brilliant guy. He crafted the labyrinth of inescapable complexity for King Minos, but had made the mistake of helping someone escape that labyrinth and bringing the wrath of the despotic Minos upon him and his son. So Minos imprisoned Daedalus and his son Icarus in a tower, and Daedalus, being the fabulous inventor that he was, looks around and says, well, what can we do? How can we get out of here? And there's feathers from the birds that are in the tower with them and wax from the candles, and he realizes that he can make wings out of these materials for his son and himself. But before they leave, he makes sure to caution his son not to fly too high, unless the sun would melt the wax from that's holding the feathers to the wings. The feathers fall off and they plummet to their doom, and you can see from the picture that the classic story ends up that way. Icarus doesn't listen, and this is often used as a story to talk about the dangers of innovation or invention or hubris, and very commonly as a myth about the importance of knowing your limits, of listening to your wiser elders. The thing is, most of us don't remember the rest of the story. There's another part to the story that doesn't get told as much because that's not what Icarus did. And so we'll come back to that at the very end. So keep that in mind, that there's more to the Icarus story than most of us remember. So you've already had a lot of information from folks today about the transition to college assessment and placement. Most of our community colleges and many of our public four-year institutions are open or near open enrollment institutions. And being open enrollment, this requires some understanding of the educational needs of our students, because they may be coming with a wide variety of different levels of preparation, of different both academic and non-academic needs. And so we have to spend some time making sure that we are meeting those needs, right? And the goal of assessment is to place students at the most appropriate level for their skill, where the challenge of the course matches their skill level. And there's a long history of this work in both research and education, but also in more recent research in positive psychology, that you get the best experiences educationally, you get the best experiences personally, where you are challenged at the limits of your skill level, right? We talk about, how to support students with the appropriate scaffolding in the class to help them succeed at the maximum level. You get all these really remarkable educational and personal experiences when you match those things, when students are challenged at an appropriate level for their skill. One of the things I want to take a step back and talk about then, why we need to think about assessment more carefully and why multiple measures in assessment are important. And this is going to go back to some things that you probably covered in graduate school that you really weren't terribly interested in, but it's worth kind of bringing this back to bear. And that is, how do you measure anything, right? And the problem that we have, or the reality of measurement, is whenever you measure something, in this case, we're trying to measure a student's level of preparation or their skills in a particular discipline. Whenever you measure anything, you get a variety of things. One thing that you get is the thing you care about. What we talk about is the true score, right? What you're trying to measure, in this case, skill or ability or the capacity to do college level work or to achieve in a particular course. But you also get other things with it. You get systematic error, so error that's regular or a bias that's part of the measurement. And anytime you use a single method, that increases the vulnerability to this type of error. So if you measure just using one thing and it's not a good measure, then you're not going to get very meaningful information out. You're not going to measure what you're trying to get. You also get random error, right? Temporary errors, things that are a consequence of that moment in time when you measure things. And so anytime you use a single instance of a measurement, that increases the vulnerability to error and reduces the quality of what we're measuring. So what we're trying to do in assessment, right, the gold standard is to try and avoid those things, to avoid systematic and random error. And the way to do this is to triangulate by measuring things across different methods of assessment, to measure things across different contexts of assessment. So contexts, give you an example from California. A lot of colleges, community colleges in California, have actually changed the context of where they do the assessment to go directly to the high schools, and that's happening elsewhere as well. And the reason for that is students tend to do better when measured in a context with which they're familiar than when they're brought onto a college campus for the first time or have to navigate a college campus for the first time. And I don't know what the signage and parking is like at your campuses, but trust me, in California, it's difficult to navigate. And then you have to immediately take an assessment test. Content domains, you want to make sure that what you're measuring is not being constrained specifically by like some of the aspects of what you're measuring. I'll give you an example in mathematics where content, a particular type of content, can prevent the true measurement of a student's score. And so in one of my good friends in the system here in the IR immigrated to the United States as a young child from the Ukraine and has moved through our entire educational system, K-12, community college, the state university system, to get where he is today. And he still remembers his community college math assessment because he really struggled to answer one of the questions, which was to estimate the weight of a football team. So the weight of a football team means something very different for someone who was born and raised in the United States than it means for virtually anyone else in the entire world. And so having that kind of content leads to error. So we want to make sure that we're varying the content so things like that aren't mucking up our assessment. And we want to make sure that we're measuring things across time so that we're not just capturing something at a particular moment. I'll give you a couple of examples from my time at Long Beach. We would tend to do assessment at two dominant times, one of which was at the end of the day. So when students would get off school or adults would get off work, we'd have assessment sessions late in the afternoon or in early evening. And it's worth thinking about what people are like, what you're like at the end of a workday, right? Are you at your best? Is that going to measure your capacity to do things well? I would argue not. And in our household, actually, we have a general practice for everyone. Everyone gets 5 minutes. When they get home, there's no new questions, there's no new anything, no new business. Everyone gets 5 minutes after the end of the day to become a human being again and be able to engage with the other members of our household. So kids and adults. The other time that we would measure assessment at Long Beach was we would try and set up super registration types of days where we could get in a lot of students from a particular district, so we could provide them the assessment and ed plans and registration all at once, right? So it would be a big day, but to be able to do that so that all the students from a district could come and so that our staff and faculty could be there, it would have to be on a Saturday. And to accommodate schedules and get everything in that day, we'd start it early, right? So we typically start somewhere before 8 o'clock with the assessment, starting at 8 a.m. on a Saturday. So I don't know if you remember what it's like to be a young adult, or whether or not you might have young adults living in your household like I do at home. And I can tell you 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday is really not a real time. It's abstract. Most of them are not at their best, and many of them are not even alert or even awake at that time. So I would say if I let my two teenagers sleep until until they were stopped by biology, they would probably wake up about 1 or 2 in the morning, or 1 or 2 in the afternoon most days. And there's lots of developmental education research looking at this that suggests that young adults in particular are not high functioning early in the morning, to the extent that which many K-12 districts across the country are looking at moving the start day for high school later, right? An hour to an hour and a half later, to accommodate students, young adults' natural biological rhythms. So this is what we should be doing. We should be triangulating across using different methods of assessment, triangulating across using different contexts of assessment, different content domains, different times. Everyone who's ever taught in the classroom understands this. No one gives a single question at the end of the term to measure whether or not a student's learned the material. But one of the things that's very powerful here is once you start to look at this type of list, this is something that we actually have access to relatively cheaply or often free. And this is essentially what high school GPA is. Students' cumulative high school grade point average measures students' performance in academic settings across many different methods of both formative and summative assessments, across different instructors, across many different content domains, and across up to 4 years of high school. So you're building an assessment measure of students' capacity that basically at the heart of it has tens of thousands of formative and summative assessments of students' academic performance over time. It would be hard for us and would cost millions of dollars for us to design something like that from scratch. The reality of current practice, however, is very few people use that. You see an expansion of that in the last few years, but just less than a decade ago, most people were using primarily standardized tests across the country, with only a quarter using anything other than the test in math, and less than that in reading and composition. In 2016, there was a new study came out. It looks like it's a little bit higher, but still, it doesn't look like it is higher. More colleges are using other things, and the most typical one is some measure of high school GPA. But when you drill down and look what they're doing, most of them are still using the standardized assessment as the anchor, right, or the primary method, and then they are adjusting around that using high school GPA. And what I'm going to argue is that at the very least, we should probably be considering doing the opposite. We've already talked a little bit about some of the consequences of this. The majority of students across the country are placed below college level. Sorry, I think I accidentally... let me see if I can. Are you guys seeing that arrow, Jenny? That yellow arrow still?
I see a cartoon.
Okay, that's great. So you're not seeing the little pen yellow arrow. That's good. All right.
I see a little pen yellow arrow, but it's not troubling. Now it's gone.
All right, I got it. Okay. So what's been happening over the last 3 or 4 decades is that the vast majority of students across all of our systems are being assessed into or assigned into developmental education. The sorting hat for our colleges basically puts everyone in the not college ready house, or the vast majority of students into the not college ready house. And we've already gone over some of the consequences of placement. All right, placement below college level is a significant barrier to completion. Peter walked you through some of Tom Bailey and the CCRC's work. One of the things, Lexa did that. And one of the things that most people don't realize is that a big chunk of why students don't complete developmental education is a huge percentage of students who are placed there never take a single course in the sequence. So this is one of the things that Lexa was referring to when she was talking about the summer melt for students who are placed into DevEd, and you see this in virtually all of the CCRC studies. Of the students that are placed there, only about a third to 2/5 will complete the developmental education sequence in 6 or more years, much less finish the final course, final gateway course. And there's some really fantastic work that was done by one of my colleagues out here in California, Greg Stout, at the Contra Costa Community College District, and you can see more detail about his work there. But what he did is for his district, he looked at the kind of demographic distribution of all of the students in the district from the moment that they applied through virtually every different kind of signpost of college transition, like what happens to them in assessment and placement, what types of courses do they take in their first semester, how well do they do in those courses, basically things like GPA, course completion rates, whether or not they persist to the next semester, what do they take in their second semester, do they enter a program of study, do they hit different unit milestones, all the way out to students' completion of a meaningful educational outcome, some certificate, an associate's degree, or a transfer to a four-year institution. Right, and all of our colleges in the system and pretty much everywhere have enormous equity gaps in completion of meaningful educational outcomes. And what he was able to do is isolate where those things appear when students are in college. And so when he compared students at application to the local community, they look very similar to the local community. They're a little bit younger overall, not surprisingly. But compared to adults, they look just like the local community. And they're on point. They look like they're going to go. Where you see the equity gaps in college completion first appear is in assessment and placement. A majority of the gaps that we have in outcomes are already in place before students set foot in their first course on the campus. And the other presenters have also talked about some of the other impacts that this has on students, and it's really worth kind of underscoring that this method has really created a set of interactions with students that changes their front door experience with all of us, right? Their first interaction with us is that really likely communicates a lack of our trust in their capacity. We don't mean to, and we often kind of try our best to buttress that and talk about how we're trying to help make sure that you succeed. But if you talk to counselors that speak to students who've gone through these assessment tests, that's not how they experience them. They experience them as a threat, as a invalidation of their work to date. For many of them, it's a catastrophic experience that changes how they think about themselves in education. And it's often not just that first interaction. Often our second interaction with the counselors have to convince them to take the courses that they've been placed into. And the third interaction in our developmental education sequences, we have to convince students to take that course seriously, even if they think that they shouldn't have been placed there. All of these things create this constant set of communications about what we believe about students' capacity. And it implies to many of the students that most, which often gets rounded to all when we talk about it, that students aren't ready for college and likely to fail. And we have convinced many people of this. If you listen to how people talk about community college students and their likelihood of success, people are generally pretty downbeat about whether or not community college students have what it takes to succeed in college. And that includes many of our students. And I think Peter did a really good job of talking about the types of messages that students have internalized over their lifetime and how they take responsibility for many things, including things at our institutions that are not their fault. So the conventional wisdom explaining all of this, the students aren't succeeding, generally revolves around something about today's students. Students today are simply vastly unprepared for college. They don't take education seriously. They're turning in essays with emojis in them. They talk in leet speak. I can't get them off their digital devices. They won't read anything. It's something about kids today that make them really uniquely and newly unsuitable for our college. And we're going to go through some of that, but I think the first thing you need to do is reorient yourself to think about that particular explanation that most people often reach for as a gross categorization of students, because odds are they said the same thing about you. right? So I can go back to when I was coming out of high school as one of the early members of Generation X, and how they talked about my generation of students as being the worst ever, right? This is, I don't know if you guys remember news magazines. They were these things you used to be able to buy or subscribe to. Here's a cover from Time and an article from Newsweek, and the Newsweek article is just delicious in its discussion of Generation X, calling us pusillanimous purveyors of pseudo-angst, who, if we would put as much effort into getting a life as we do about writing about our horrible fate, we'd be spared the weekly diatribes that pass for reasoned argument. This is the way people talked about us, that we were the worst ever. We were the first people to be a boomerang generation of students who came back and lived with their family. That's back again. And it was really quite something for everyone to like dump on us as a generation. The interesting thing about that, right, is the people who were characterizing my generation that way were baby boomers, right? And before they were called baby boomers, they were really often called hippies. And there were complete Broadway musicals about musical numbers about whether or not kids those days were any good, right? So there was a great musical number from Bye Bye Birdie. People have complained about kids today for a very, very long time. So it's worth reviewing whether or not this conventional wisdom that we often land on as older adults is actually true. And it doesn't seem to be any evidence for that whatsoever. So if you look at IQ tests, how people in general perform on IQ tests have to be are normed so that the average is 100, right? So if you're above 100, you're above average in intelligence. If you're below average. And one of the things that's happening is they have to constantly be renormed every 5 to 7 years because people have been regularly getting smarter. Right? If we gave everyone on this webinar, if we gave most people today a IQ test from the 1940s and 50s, everyone would score very well, and most of us would score at genius level types of performance. That's how different the types of questions that people are asked and how they perform on IQ tests are today versus, a generation or two ago. If you look at the number of young adults with a high school degree or equivalent, it's the highest it's ever been. It continues to creep up year after year. If you look at the gold standard for assessment, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, this is sometimes referred to as the nation's report card. They do lots of really fantastic work to design high-performing assessments, and they do really careful randomized block designs to make sure they're assessing students across all different types of schools and environments and states and rural versus urban versus suburban. And across all of these things, what you see is that students are at or near all-time highs in virtually every demographic category, with maybe a slight decrease in the most recent year. Basically, what you see is math performance, reading performance in 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 17-year-olds across all the major demographic groups that have been measured across that time have been increasing. You see maybe a little bit of a leveling off of reading performance among 17-year-olds in the most recent years, but it's not the case that students are getting worse. And then we have evidence from our fields in which research really is calling into question the effectiveness of standardized assessment for understanding student capacity. It's poorly related to college course outcomes. There's a ton of research from the CCRC on this. Sorry, I meant to mention this. All of these bit.ly links that you're going to see throughout take you to the original research as best I can, right? So wherever I can, I'm trying to direct you to other resources beyond this presentation. And you can access all of those from the actual bit.ly link at the beginning. The other thing that comes up is you see this enormous variability in where people set the cut scores using these standardized tests, as if we don't actually agree about their relationship to college readiness or college preparation. And then the kicker is that two-year colleges very frequently use higher cut scores than four-year colleges. We hold our students to a higher readiness standard than four-year colleges do, and I guarantee you that no one anywhere is giving us credit for that, saying that we have more rigor in how students are getting access to college level work in the two-year colleges. And then lastly, one of the things you almost always see with these measures of student capacity that are measured using standardized assessments is that not only do they not measure students' capacity very well, They, in particular, underestimate the capacity of students of color, of women, particularly in mathematics, of first-generation college students, of low SES students, of students with an ELL background. So you see that not only do they not do a good job overall, but they tend to not, in particular, not do a good job at measuring the assessment of measuring the capacity of students that we typically serve in public institutions. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of that. This comes from work in North Carolina done by CCRC. This is adapted from a presentation from Brad Bostian. I like to refer to this as my Sesame Street slide. I don't know if you guys remember, Sesame Street used to, I think it still does, has a game called One of These Things is Not Like the Others. One of these measures of student capacity is not like the others. So on the bottom for both English and math, you can see how well different subcomponents of the AccuPlacer test, different subcomponents of the ACID test, and different subcomponents of the Compass test predict performance in English and math. You'll notice that some of them in math and English are 0. And in fact, a couple of those zeros are actually negative because these are variants, and so we're squaring them. So you really have poor predictive utility. This performance on standardized assessments do not predict performance in our colleges very well. And that's really assessment's one job, is understand how students are going to do in our courses, so we put them in the right ones. And it's not very good at that. One of the questions during, I think, Lex's presentation was whether or not the standardized assessments or GPA was more or less effective or accurate. Well, using high school GPA is both more accurate, it's a better predictor, and more effective. So I just wanted to kind of go back to that. Here's some work. One of the things, I have a version of this slide deck that does something very much like Lex's people said thing. And one of the things that people always say, well, that's North Carolina or that's California. That doesn't apply to us. And one of the examples of that was Alaska, which has a very different set of student populations that they serve, and they serve it in a different way than in many other states. So you have 2-year and 4-year students that are commingled. You have a lot of students that might be in one building K through 12 organizations. You have lots of rural students that don't have the same experience. And what they want to do is test whether or not you see the same relationships there. And so for both 2- and 4-year students, whether or not they're assessed via the SAT, the ACT, or AccuPlacer, students' high school GPA is a substantially better predictor of students' performance in both English and mathematics in the University of Alaska system. Right? In some cases, you're talking about 10 to 20 times more variance accounted for, 10 to 20 times more performance in the course that's explained by GPA than is explained by student performance on these assessment instruments. One of the consequences of this is that students are forced to repeat courses that they successfully completed in high school. If you stay within a system, like within a community college, you get a C in a course, you move on to the next course. Same thing at a university, generally speaking. That's not true when students move between systems. In the California community colleges, 3/4 of students will repeat one or more levels of courses that they took in mathematics. 76% of students who successfully complete Algebra 2 have to take Algebra 2 or lower over again. 68% of students who had a B or better in that course start at intermediate algebra or lower. Of students who started in pre-calculus, half of them are going to start at intermediate algebra or lower, and about 40% of the students who had a B in pre-calculus in high school will start at intermediate algebra or lower. This has real consequences for whether or not students are going to complete college and whether or not we're going to have meaningful, powerful STEM pipelines to get all the STEM degrees that virtually everyone says we need to improve on. Even in the CSU system, which draws on a very different population, about a third of students are repeating one or more levels of math that they have successfully completed in high school. So one of the questions I want you to be asking, hopefully you're asking already, is what if the problem with some of our developmental progression has not been with the limitations of our students, at least not solely, but it has at least in part had to do with the limitations in how we have assessed and understood their capacity to do college level work. And then we have to ask an additional question, whether or not our method of assessing and understanding their capacity is actually making things worse, right? By meeting them at the front door, questioning their capacity, giving them self-doubt, whether or not the way that we think about student preparation influences how we teach them, the way that we answer questions, the way that we evaluate work via things like self-fulfilling prophecies, their goal effects, the stereotype threat effects on vulnerable students, the activation or reinforcement of negative theories of education that students may have, stuff that Yeager and others have talked about, and Carol Dweck and many others, that we're actually contributing to students' lack of completion by the way that we treat them as they come to us, right? So that's the low point of my talk, and we're just going to go up from there. So I apologize for that, but it's worth us considering that, especially given a lot of the things that both Peter and Lex have talked about. The good news is it's possible then that one of the key barriers to our students' transition to and success in college is something that we actually have a ton of control over and that we can change relatively rapidly. I've seen colleges change this type of thing, how they assess, the methods that they use to assess students, in less than a week before the Thanksgiving holiday, to make sure that students can get access to something better as soon as possible. That's not easy. It was a very unusual situation where they had some things in place, but these are things that we can change quickly that have outsized impacts on students' progression. I'm going to talk to you about two approaches to improving assessment through evidence-based multiple measures. You can see links to some of them there for more information. One of which is something I shepherded through as the Director of Institutional Research at Long Beach City College with many other colleagues. And then the other is a much bigger statewide project in California, the Multiple Measures Assessment Project, of which I'm a member of a large team, including one from Michigan, Peter Barr. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of those to give you a sense of what's possible if we assess students' capacity more accurately. So Long Beach City College, we did a bunch of research using cohorts of students who had come from one of our local feeders that we had a very close relationship with and we could get data easily for. And we wanted to look at this particular study just as students who matriculated directly because we wanted to make sure they didn't go anywhere else and get skills. They didn't go to an employer and develop new skills. They didn't make a stop at a four-year institution or another community college and pick up skills along the way. We just wanted to make sure that we understood how high school performance predicted college performance without other stuff getting in the way. And we really just had two questions. How does what they do in high school predict how students assess and place in our system? And how do students perform in those classes once they get there? And then really we had this kind of subtle question we weren't really planning for, which is how well are those things actually aligned? We expected them to be pretty well aligned. So I'm going to show you some ordinal and logistic regression coefficients. It doesn't have to be real complicated. Higher numbers mean that they have a stronger relationship to the thing they're predicting. So first we're going to predict placement in English at Long Beach City College. And we're going to look at students' performance on the California Standards Test in English Language Arts. In 11th grade, that's the last standardized test they take in high school before college. Their performance in their 12th grade English class and their overall cumulative GPA, not including that 12th grade English, right? So we use a bunch of other things. It's a much more complicated analysis. You can see more of it in some of those links, but those are the three that we're going to focus on. So first, we're going to predict how close to transfer level do students place, how high in our sequence do they place. Students' performance on the standardized tests in high school, enormously powerful predictor of how they do on our standardized test. We've used a couple of different ones across this time period, with the last one being acuplacer. Very powerfully predicts acuplacer. In fact, one of the first things that happened when we saw this, we thought, well, we can save $5 to $7 per student because we may not actually need to give them acuplacer, especially once we saw the next thing, which is how students did in their 12th grade English class had no relationship at all with how students placed. So getting an A in 12th grade English, also we have some course controls in there, but regardless of the course, getting an A in 12th grade English did not lead students to be placed higher or lower, right? It had no relationship to how they were placed. And their overall GPA has a somewhat of a relationship for predicting placement, so we were a little bit happy with that, but it's not very strong, especially compared to how well the standardized test did. So we figured we could probably just use the standardized test. And so if the right side of this slide and the left side of this slide match, then we have a well-aligned placement system. The things that are predicting performance is what's predicting placement, so we're much more likely to be getting students into the course that's right for them. But all of you guys are on this webinar, and I'm on this webinar, and I've seen this slide. I can tell you it's not going to match up. So how students did on their standardized tests in high school predicts performance in high school, performance in our college English courses very weakly. It's not zero, so if that's all you have, that's great, but it's not a strong predictor. How they did in their last English classroom, much stronger predictor of how they do in their next English classroom at Long Beach City College, and how they did in classroom after classroom, semester after semester, year after year, is very predictive of students' performance in our English classes at Long Beach City College. Similar set of patterns for mathematics. Their last standardized test in mathematics predicts what course they're going to be placed into very powerfully, how they did in that math course, and how their overall GPA is a weak predictor, is not significant. And again, it flips around where the performance on the standardized test is a predictor of performance in mathematics, but not a very strong one. And how they did in class after class, semester after semester, is an enormously powerful predictor of how they're going to do in the math classes across our math curriculum at Long Beach City College. So the key takeaways here are not really rocket science. They often are surprising to people in some kind of abstract way, but when you actually say them out loud, they're not surprising at all. Assessments are supposed to predict how students will perform in our colleges. That's their job. Instead, what seems to be the case is previous standardized tests are very powerful predictors of later standardized tests, but not very powerful predictors of students' performance in the classroom, right? Which is ultimately what we really care about. Previous classroom performance powerfully predicts later classroom performance, especially classroom performance across lots of classes. And it doesn't actually predict standardized test performance very well. And generally speaking, more information is going to tell us more about a student's capacity to succeed in college than less, right? And so if we can, we want to use all of the information that predicts their performance to get them in the right class. And so that's what we did at Long Beach City College. We took their overall high school GPA, their last high school course in discipline, so we know how far they got. They're great in that course. We even used their last standardized test in the discipline because it was predictably useful. We just used it in proportion to its predictive utility. And then we placed students in the highest course where the predicted success rate was higher than our average historical success rate for that course. Right? They put them in the highest course of the two. We had this alternative multiple measures, but we also allowed students to continue to be placed via our standardized tests. We didn't take those away, so no one could be hurt by this, by losing an opportunity to be placed in the college level work. So this just gives you a sense of some historical comparisons. In the darker gray, it's all first-time students from at Long Beach City College. In red, you have the previous cohort of Long Beach Unified School District students that we're going to look at in fall 2012. And then in light gray, we have their placements if we had continued to just use the standardized test for those students. And you can see they're basically the same quality students as we generally get in the previous cohort. What happens if we use their overall performance to overall high school performance as one of the elements for predicting their performance in college? And you get a very different sense of students' readiness. So we go from placing 14% into transfer level English or college level English to 60%, 4 times as much. We go from 9% of students being placed in the college level math to 30%, 3 times as much. The success rates for those students were equal or higher to those for students who got to the college level course either via regular placement or progression through the sequence, but their completion of the gateway course is 2 to 3 times higher as a cohort. So they succeed just as much. Those students were always ready. These are the students that Lexa was referring to that the CCRC has identified as being likely to succeed in the course, but who are being kept out by the assessment. And once they have that opportunity, they're much more likely to complete the college level course. So I want to jump to the multiple measures assessment project. This is a huge project. It started off with 10 colleges participating. We now have almost the entire system participating in one way or another. We're kind of wrapping up this project as we shift into a new era in California, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we have about 90 colleges across the system that are participating in one way or another. I'm going to talk a little bit about the results for some early adopters in a minute. And this was just a very straightforward kind of there's a couple of things in between, larger replication of the work that we did at Long Beach City College using slightly different techniques. We used some classification and regression tree models that they're a little bit better at some kind of details. If you have missing high school data, or you have nonlinear effects, or you have interactions between variables, it does a better job of capturing all of that. And we just wanted to check to see what types of things would predict college performance using high school records. And we set a very conservative approach again. We were targeting students who would have a greater than 70% success rate in their first college level class, what we call transfer level class. And the reason we chose that is because the average success rate in transfer level English in the state was about 69 to 70%, annually. It's a little bit lower in transfer level mathematics, but we didn't want to set a different lower target for math than was set for English, just to be fair. So we're setting a relatively conservative target of identifying students who are essentially likely to be average or better compared to the students that we have in our system currently. And then we work with pilot colleges. They conduct local replications of our research. They test individual models. They pilot the use and placement, provide feedback to us. Where we landed as a system through the multiple measures assessment project is that, and there's a huge amount of detail. We place students all the way up to calculus, all the way down to pre-algebra, and throughout the English and reading and ESL sequences. I'm just going to call out 3 different entry-level courses here, entry-level college-level courses. In English, statistics, for students on statistics or liberal arts pathway, and pre-calculus, which is one of our more rigorous college-level STEM entry points. So for students who had a high school GPA of 2.6 or better in high school, those students are likely to succeed in a transfer level English course, and so the argument is to put them directly in that course. For statistics, students with a high school GPA greater than 3.0 or a high school GPA greater than 2.3, and they made it to pre-calculus. So they're a very good student, or they're not quite as a good student, but they're a much better math student. And then for pre-calculus, a higher GPA, 3.4, and at least the completion of Algebra 2 in high school, or a lower GPA of 2.6, and they made it to calculus, though they may not have completed it. So if we look at our historical placement rates, they're a little bit higher than they were at Long Beach City College for the system, but generally about 85% of students are being placed into one or more developmental education sequences. If we just use students' high school performance, you more than double the placement into transfer level English, and you more than double the placement, almost triple the placement into transfer level math, right? So a minimum into statistics, but allowing multiple different pathways. This is a little bit busy, so I'm going to summarize it in the middle, but I just want to show you these are some of our early adopters. And basically what you see is pretty much across the board, maybe a little bit higher in some places, maybe a little bit lower in other places, the students who are placed via this alternative measure of student capacity do just as well, right? And so we can summarize it here. For students who were placed traditionally or got there through the sequence, their success rate at college level in English was 71% at our various pilot colleges. If they were placed there via the MAP system, their success rate was 73%. In mathematics, the success rate was 67% for students in a college level math course. For the MAP placed students, their success rate was also 67%. But that's just for students who take the course. One of the things to keep track of is all the students that we're talking about would have been students who would have been placed below college level. So it's worth not just comparing them to the college level students, but to students who would have been placed 1 or 2 levels before, which is predominantly what these students would have been, and what their gateway course completion would have been. So the gateway course completion for the MAP students, they take the college level, that's their gateway course completion in 1 semester. What about students who started 1 or 2 levels below? They're far less likely to complete the college level English course, and they're much, much less likely to complete a college level math course. So we're identifying students who can succeed in college level, and getting them there makes them much more likely in a single semester to complete that college level course than they would have if placed even just 1 level below, given 2 years to complete that course. The question then becomes, what about everyone else, right? And this really is going to dovetail with what Lexa and Peter were talking about. What maximizes their completion of Gateway English and Math? So we previously identified students who were highly likely to successfully complete the college level course, 70% or higher. Can we identify any students who are more likely to complete a Gateway English or Math college level course if they start in developmental education? So I'm going to go back to the slide I showed earlier for students who were placed indirectly and add a couple of additional bars to that to look at students who are the least likely to succeed in college based on their high school performance. So you can see that top bar is the same as before, right? The students highly likely to succeed that we've been arguing for direct placement, who were successful, placed there directly into English, statistics, and pre-calculus. But we can also then use that same analysis, and you can see the trees in the analysis at the links at the bottom to identify the students who have the lowest likelihood of success, right? So students in English below a 1.9, students in statistics below a 2.3, and students in pre-calculus who have no pre-calculus and a high school GPA, so they haven't tried it and have a high school GPA of less than 2.6. So what happens to those students, right? And one of the nice things about our system is because it's large, there's lots of variation in how students may or may not get into courses that allows us to look at what happens to those students if they somehow manage to get into a college level course. So, oh shoot, I'm not showing the yellow bar, which is, so the yellow bar is what happens to students if they just start directly in that course, right? So you can see 12% of students in college composition, if they're placed there, of students who start, who had a high school GPA of less than 1.9, of those students, only 12% of them will successfully complete a college level course if they're placed there directly. No, I'm sorry, I've got that backwards because I can't see it. I'm trying to do it. That's actually the throughput rate from one level below. So excuse me, let me restart. So students who start one level below, who have a high school GPA of less than 1.9, 12% of those students will complete a college level course within the first year. For students below a 2.3 who start one level below, that's intermediate algebra, who start one level below in mathematics, only 10% of them will complete statistics in a year, and of students who start one level below, only 13% of them who have a high school GPA less than 2.6, who had Algebra 2, and then we're doing some other controls to make sure that they're on a STEM pathway kind of thing. Only 13% of them will complete any transfer level math, not just pre-calculus, but any transfer level math course. So what happens then if we look at the students who manage to get access to that college level course? So students who are placed into college level English directly with no additional support, who are amongst that lowest group of high school performance, they successfully complete the college level course at a 43% rate, compared to only 12% who finish that college level course successfully if they start one level below. In statistics, it's 40% of students placed directly in statistics amongst the least prepared group, and 38% of students completing pre-calculus if they start there. Now, we throw a lot of other things at that to make sure we're carefully adjusting for the ways that they might have gotten in there. It doesn't make much difference in English. It makes a little bit more difference in mathematics, partly because standardized tests tend to be a little bit more predictively useful in mathematics. But basically, even when you throw the kitchen sink at it, students who start in statistics or in pre-calculus, again, given some caveats, are far more likely to complete that course if they start there than if they start even just one level below, right? Same students, so we're comparing similar students to similar students. They're much more likely to complete the college level course if they start there.
That, John,
I
want to pause there because I think that's a key point in the presentation, and I think that I'm going to give people a minute to digest that. So basically what you're saying is that that a student, even if a student is estimated to be very unlikely to complete by their either testing or GPA or any method that we look at, the student is still more likely to complete the college level course if they're placed directly into it than if they are remediated in the traditional way.
That's right.
You're saying.
That's right. And this is actually something that's not new. You can see from work done at ASU back in the 90s that they found the same exact thing by accident. They had a small randomized controlled trial in which they were exploring different approaches to students going through developmental education at Arizona State. And what they found is that students this doesn't even look at whether or not they're likely to complete the college level course. Students who are going to be assigned to remedial English, who are randomly assigned just to be allowed to take the college level course, were actually more likely to complete the college level course than students who were randomly assigned to start in remediation were to complete the remediation course.
Wow.
So there's lots of evidence that our assessment and placing students into these courses actually is not only not helping them, it's actually making them less likely to complete the course, less likely to complete the gateway course. And you see that through a lot of regression discontinuity studies looking at students that are essentially on either side of a cut score. So they're essentially one or two questions different in their performance. One student did a little bit better, they got into the college level course. Another student did one or two questions worse, got bumped down, got an entire additional semester of help from us at the college than the student who just snuck by the cut score. And those students actually become less likely to successfully complete the college level course. That's the problem, right? It's a institutional structure issue that doesn't serve our students well. And when you combine it with the types of things that Peter is talking about, that's possible, right? You can have a transformative effect on student completion.
Right, and that's just a stunning piece of information for people that were trained in sort of traditional methods of developmental education, and kind of calls into question so many ways that we do things. So I just wanted to call people's attention to that. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to let you go ahead and go on.
Okay. It's kind of strange when you think about it, though, because it's something that K-12 education has known for some time, right? They figured out for students who start in like kindergarten and first grade, if they're starting behind, it doesn't help them very much if you try and slow things down and pull them out of the mainstream. The way to get students to be more successful is to keep them in the mainstream and support them there. Right, and those students are far more likely to catch up than students who essentially have to take a slower track to catch up. So that's covering essentially some baseline, but no one's arguing for that. I'm certainly not arguing that you should put your lowest performing high school students directly in the college level work without support. But even without support, we expect them to be more successful, and they have in the past, more likely to complete the college level course. What happens if you support them? Here's a couple early adopters of co-requisite work in mathematics in California. They broke people down into these bands based on, they have a variety of other things going on, but they're providing co-requisite support for statistics, 2 different colleges. And you can see that even the students at the lowest level of performance with the co-requisite support, they're not having great success, but they're actually medium likely to succeed, and that 57% success rate at College A isn't terrible. And it's amazing compared to what would have happened to them otherwise, right? So if they had started one level below, the throughput rate there is either 8 to 12%, depending on the analysis. And if you place them directly without support, their success rate would be about 29%. So taking students, even the poorest performing college students, getting them into poorest performing high school students, getting them into the college level course and supporting them remarkably changes their likelihood of performance. And it has impacts across students. So they looked at the impacts for students who would have started 3, 2, or 1 levels below, and whether or not they complete college level math in 2 years. Totally transforms the likelihood of completion of college level math for students. And then they looked at what happens across students of different ethnicities, again in 2 years. Complete transformation. The African American students are 9 times more likely to complete college level math using this method than they were previously. They've also done some work with BSTEM at one of the colleges, so looking at pre-calculus and a business calculus course is a very small subset. It's the first pass. But you can see students with a high school GPA of less than 2.6, even those students in a co-requisite supported BSTEM class are, their success rates are not great, but they're pretty good, and they're far more likely to complete that course than if we had started them to complete a pre-calculus course or a business calculus course than to complete any transfer level math course, including statistics or college algebra, if they had started just 1 level below. Tennessee sees the same thing. So this comes from some presentation by Tristan Denley from the Tennessee Board of Regents work on their co-requisite stuff. Even for students at the lowest performing bands of the ACT, the likelihood of completion of the Gateway English and Math course more than doubles for those students in English, and it's 10 times as high for students in mathematics. So the future of placement for us in California, and we think probably in a lot of places, is that we're going to need to move to places where moderate to high performing high school students just progress normally the way they would if they were within our system, directly into college level courses. And for everyone else, to the extent possible, we should get them into college level work too, with additional supports. And those supports might take any of a variety of methods. The RAND Corporation has a really nice review of different co-requisite approaches. There's different ways to support students. We also have really important moves in the community colleges and public four-year colleges to thinking more carefully about students who are food and housing insecure and supporting students that way, doing all the things that are pulling students out of our classrooms. But really what we're going to focus on now is we're flipping our understanding and who's responsible. In the past, students' first experience with us was to prove that they belonged, right? You have to prove to us that you should have access to college level. In California, at the very least, now if we're going to assign them to a pre-college level course, we actually have to provide evidence that that placement is going to improve their likelihood of completing that college level course. We have to demonstrate that what we want to do for those students is actually going to help them, and that's a big change. So I just want to wrap on what I think we gained through reimagining our student capacity. And there's a lot to be gained here, and I think the other folks that you've heard from today have talked a lot about it, but I just want to underscore some of these things. The first thing, for me, that's very powerful, it's a better understanding of our students and what they're capable of. And that's so important for us to reset that, because we have been systemically and substantially underestimating their capacity to do college level work. All the evidence points to that. There's lots of triangulation across work with multiple measures, work with co-requisites, work such as in the Virginia Community College system, where one of the things they did is they just lowered the cut scores and they let more students into college level work. They didn't do anything else special. They just let more students in, and students became far more likely to complete the college level course and reduce some of their equity gaps across their more vulnerable populations. Possible transformations of student outcomes. I think Lexa did a good job of summarizing what's possible there. You can see some of it in my work. We're still kind of following that. We don't have the same longitudinal work done that Lexa has already. You see really important reductions in direct and opportunity costs for students. Like the cost of these courses for students is significant. The cost of these courses to colleges and the state is significant, but the real costs are opportunity costs. That year of a student's life is incredibly meaningful, or that semester or year, depending on how many courses they've been assigned to. That takes a year out of their productive lifespan in the workforce. And it's not taking the first year. Everyone loses the first year, or everyone has that bad first year where you don't get paid nearly as much as you hope, right? They lose the year at the end. Their productive lifespan in the workforce is shorter. Or alternatively, they use the opportunity that we're all hoping for, which is to be able to retire a little bit earlier and spend time with our grandchildren, or spend time away from our grandchildren, depending on how you feel about your grandchildren, right? Doing, traveling, reading, whatever the things that we dream about doing, they get a year less to do that. Powerful levers to really address student equity gaps that have been stubbornly persistent, and changing the way that we think about student capacity and making sure everyone has access to college level work and the support that they need to succeed in it has a really enormous potential to close these gaps. It's a renewed opportunity to have a meaningful collaboration with your K-12 educational colleagues. It was hard before, when we were basically telling them, taking the position that none of their preparation matters. In fact, it turns out that their preparation matters a lot. And this dramatically changes conversations with those K-12 partners in ways that's very powerful. I'll just give you one example from our experience at Long Beach. Prior to us doing this work at Long Beach Unified School District is a very good school district, high performing, but its requirements in mathematics for graduation were pretty straightforward and not very rigorous. Students had to attempt 2 years of mathematics. That means they had to be in a class, not complete. And they had to complete with a D or better algebra. That for us as a college was not great. Our math department regularly complained about this as something that was part of the problem. One of the things that happened is we were able to go back to them and say, listen, we've been underestimating the preparation that your students have been having. And so we're going to be able to place many more students into college level math. But there are a lot of students that we're still not, and we just want to be upfront about that. And we apologize for underestimating your capacity and what you've been doing in the past. And the first thing they wanted to know is, well, what about the other 2/3 of students in math, the other, 40% in English? In math, our conversation was pretty straightforward. Well, the problem we have is a lot of your students are only getting algebra, right? And we can't place many of them in our upper level college level math courses. And so they asked us lots of questions about different pathways, different endpoints, career math, finite math, different versions of intermediate algebra, pre-stats course, all those types of things. And we helped them with all that kind of analytics. And then they went away and they were working on it, and they came back about a year later and said, here's what's going to happen. Starting next fall, every first-time student is going to be required to take 3 years of mathematics in high school for graduation. And starting the fall after that, every student is going to be required to take 4 years of mathematics to graduate high school from Long Beach. And there's going to be a soft goal to get as many of them to intermediate algebra as possible. We won't be able to get them all there, so we can't make it a graduation requirement, but we're going to get many more of them there. That was a touchdown for our math department. And the way we got there was by accurately understanding the preparation that students were having and re-engaging meaningfully with our K-12 colleagues as partners and not as people that we blamed for our students' what we thought lack of capacity. And the more powerful thing for me is it's a real opportunity to stop meeting our students at the front door of our colleges and imply that they may not belong there. That has long-lasting consequences for our students. It has long-lasting consequences for our communities. And it's a real opportunity to re-engage at that front door. And some colleges that did the multiple measures assessment project had remarkable changes in students' enrollment, particularly in math and English courses in their first semester. And so finally, the last thing we gain is a reminder of Daedalus' second instruction in Icarus. There wasn't just the one. Remember the one because that's the one that he didn't listen to and crashed to his doom, but there was a second instruction, and that was it's just as important not to start off flying too low. If you start off flying too low, the air is too heavy, it's moist from the sea, you won't get any lift, and you'll crash just as surely. And so what's happened in community colleges and public access four-year colleges is we've spent a lot of time and effort making sure none of our students start off flying too high, that we forgot that it's just important for them not to start off flying too low. Thank you. So I think we can turn this over to questions. Again, I've tried to put a link to the, let's see. That's not working. I've tried to put all the slides are here at bit.ly/Icarus Michigan.
Great.
There's tons of resources at the Multiple Measures Assessment Project website. All kinds of resources for colleges, what we've gone through, presentations we've done, early adopter information, different resources if you're trying to do this on your own, some of our analytics. We have code available for your IR departments to look at, that type of thing. And I was just part of a really interesting panel at the Joint Mathematics meeting earlier just a month ago with some really fantastic people. Elizabeth Barnett from CCRC, shoot, I'm blanking on his name, from the Dana Center, Yuri Treisman,
Right.
that have spent long times working on this. And so that last link is a link to resources that all of us put together for people who want to read more about this. And so I just thought I would add that there as an additional resource for everybody.
Thanks so much, John, for this. I don't see any questions, but it may be that people are still thinking and formulating. I want to take a few minutes now. Oh, here's one. Okay, Patrick has a question. With this specific presentation, is this available with audio? They have all been recorded and will be posted on our website. Last week when I was trying to post some things, we were having a problem with our server, but hopefully we'll have that solved, and I'll have those presentations up for you, in the next couple of weeks. I want to, please feel free to, I'm sorry?
Yeah, can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
I also want to note I do something foolish that very few other presenters do, because I always feel that many people have lots of questions that they may not want to ask publicly, and they won't move forward without getting them answered. So that there is my direct cell phone number.
Whoa.
So that calls me directly. I just ask that you keep in mind that you're in Michigan on the East Coast, and I am in California. So make sure that you subtract 3 hours from your time before you call me and think, it's 9 o'clock, it's the beginning of my day, but it's 6 o'clock in California. But other than that, I really invite you to call me with questions.
That's great. Okay, so we do have a couple questions coming in, John. One is, I'm going to go in reverse order. One is, how do you deal with high school lag returning students in terms of like how long are those results good? Have you found?
Sure. So a couple of things on that. Let me see. I don't have it in this deck. Let me see if I can just quick switch to and show you something. I'm not sure I'll be able to do it, but let's try. Let's see. Okay, let me just get to the right deck here. Sorry, you can see I have a lot of questions available, or a lot of slides available for questions, much like Lexa has for, people have asked me a lot of questions. So high school GPA, how long is it good for, right? It's much more predictive for longer than people think. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you some data that Compass actually had in their last in the last kind of validation paper that they had before. I'm going to go back one and show you what it looked like previously. Oh, I have to get rid of that little doohickey again, huh? Oh, I'm not going to be able to do that. So this is how well Compass predicts student performance across English, arithmetic, algebra, intermediate algebra, college algebra, based on the various tests. So the tests are in parentheses. So how well does it predict English? How well does the writing skills predict English? Here's high school GPA for all of those students. The one course it doesn't appear to be very good at predicting is arithmetic. So, a course prior to pre-algebra, it doesn't predict performance very well. There's a lot of things we could talk about. I've talked to some math folks about that. I'm happy to talk about that offline. But you can see high school GPA does better by a long shot at predicting student performance overall than the Compass. And this is what Compass said, right? This is ACT when they're saying you should use our test. And they were able to show that self-reported high school GPA was a far better predictor of performance in all of those courses than the test that they were trying to sell to colleges. And then when you divide it by traditional students, so students who are coming after a short delay, they're less than 20 years old, it's better for everyone. If you're not using this for first-time students, you're making a terrible mistake. And then for non-traditional students, students who are older than 20, right, high school GPA is still outperforming things generally, maybe not for predicting intermediate algebra from algebra. It's still kind of hanging in there. But generally speaking, it remains a very strong predictor. And so one of the things we did in California is we tried to smooth that out a little bit rather than just look at all students older than 20. And so we were able to get some data for Accuplacer from all of our from a large subset of our colleges. And what you see is the correlation here between high school GPA and performance in your first community college English class by semester. So we start to run out of data in about 8 years, but you can see it's asymptoting around, a correlation of about 0.2-ish. The thing is, the gray line there is the predictive validity, is the correlation between performance on Accuplacer and students' performance in their first community college English class. And that test is taken when they come in the door, right? So a measure that's, 9 years old is still outperforming the standardized tests by quite a bit in English. In mathematics, it gets closer out at about 9 years because typically the standardized tests in mathematics are a little bit stronger predictor of performance than the standardized tests in English, but it's still asymptoting above that high school GPA is a stronger predictor of student performance even after 9 years than the AccuPlacer is when students come in the door. So what we normally say is that, and colleges have more flexibility in California to deal with this now, is after 10 years, we don't really know very well how strongly predictive these various things are, but what we can see at 9 years suggests that they're, at best, the high school GPA is doing a little bit better, and looks like we'll continue to do so. And so and there's good reasons to think or to understand why that would be true, and one of them is it's a measure of performance taking over 4 years of time. So it's essentially measuring the consistency of students' academic performance across a large period of time, and it's much more likely to be a stable measure of their broad academic capacity, right? Defined broadly, like, do you come to class prepared? Have you done the reading? Do you keep track of the assignments? Do you show up? Or do you actually do the homework, right? All the things that go into being a successful student, in addition to the skills that are specific to the class, that stuff, doing that reliably day after day, semester after semester, year after year, predicts pretty well that you're going to continue to do that for a really significant period of time.
Okay, and I have a couple of follow-up questions from Caroline, but I'm going to segue to some of Char's questions here, and then we'll go back to Caroline. Charlotte said, we just passed our policy to look at high school GPA first, then SAT. Advice, we are having a few folks struggling. And by that, Char, I assume you have staff struggling with the concept, or what could you say to your college staff besides what you've just said in this presentation? Any further words of wisdom for your?
Well, I guess it depends on what struggling is, right? So
Yeah.
if it's struggling, so there's a couple of things that will happen with that, right? So one of the things that's happened in our entry-level, college-level courses is they're not first-year student courses in the way that they might have been at one time. So I can tell you, when I was at Long Beach, the modal time of a student to take a college-level English course, right? I'm sorry, of the students enrolled in college-level English course, what was the modal years for them to get there? It's about 3.5. That's not a freshman course. That's essentially a junior or senior seminar. So one of the things that does change is you have first-year students in those courses in much greater numbers than you might have had before. So they have the capacity to do the work, but they may need more introduction to college than students or than instructors teaching those courses are used to. So they may not know where the student support services are, the types of things that Peter was talking about. They're brand new to that, right? They don't know what things how to navigate college for the first time. They're brand new. So some of the struggle is going to be with teaching first-time students in first-year courses again. That's going to be part of it. And so some of those students are going to be green. Some of their success rates might be a little bit lower. Typically what we see is maybe you have a drop-off of 1 or 2, depending on how far down you went. Obviously, one of the things that instructors do struggle with is that you have students that are younger and a little bit less mature in those courses. So in addition to the college kind of like, do you know how to college yet? You also have some, do you know how to adult yet skill sets that have to be worked on. One of the big implementation things does happen below college level. So if you're maintaining below college level courses, the students that you had down there that were ready for college level, that were in those courses and were highly successful because they didn't actually need that instruction as much, those students aren't there anymore. So the students that remain in the college level courses all really need that course. They're much more likely to have greater needs than the students that you pulled up into college level via multiple measures. If it's, are folks struggling with believing it? I got to tell you, everywhere I've been, folks struggle to believe this. We've spent a pretty long time, about 40 years, having a variety of different people tell us that public education is failing and that it's not preparing students adequately. And that all started with A Nation at Risk which was a really poorly done study that was not done by researchers, and that fell victim to a really kind of classic methodological problem called the Simpsons paradox, and came up with conclusions that everyone loved politically, right? Was that it looked like our students weren't doing as well, or that we had plateaued, and so folks on the left said, look, we need to put more money into public education, and folks on the right said, look, public education is failing, we need to privatize it. So there was something in there for everyone. But it turns out that that overall finding was hidden or was produced by something that they didn't actually look at in the results that came out about a decade later, which is that for every demographic group, students were doing better. Across all demographic groups, students were improving. What was happening is, because more students were entering secondary education that had previously been kept out of it, the distribution of those demographic groups were changing. And so what happened is, though everyone was improving and secondary education was still improving students' outcomes across the board and pretty significantly and getting better, because we were shifting students into education that had been kept out before, it made it look like we were plateauing. And so we have to unlearn a lot of beliefs about public education. We have to unlearn a lot of beliefs about student capacity, and we need to do them quickly because those beliefs are undermining our students' performance.
Thank you. We just have a couple questions. Let me put, like, we talked a little bit about the students who have been out of high school for a long time. What about students who didn't finish high school? Do you have, how are you
Sure.
doing that with this?
So our basic, where we've basically landed is that for the majority of students, the appropriate approach is going to be to get them into college level courses. And if they don't have all of the skills necessary, to support them in those courses with co-requisite material. Now, there are some students, like if they've never taken high school, right, for students who are recent immigrants to the United States, and so they really are truly, English is a recent second language for them. So they didn't start off with English as a second language, but have been educated in our system. Students for whom it's really a foreign language still. For a lot of those students, you may have different approaches, absolutely. But it's worth thinking about what proportion of those students you actually have. Mm-hmm. Because people tend to overestimate that proportion of students out in this tail, and tend not to move for all the rest of the students because they're concerned about that subset. One of the things that can happen with this work, where you combine these two approaches, assessing more students directly in, supporting more students in college level, is that it streamlines the assessment process that then would allow you to actually provide more, careful counseling and advising to those students at intake that are in that longer tail to figure out what the best approach for them would be. And it may be that you may maintain some, you'll definitely probably maintain some adult education if you have that already, and some below college level work for a subset of students. But the bottom line of all this work points to the same thing, and that is successful students should progress naturally, and you should almost never force students to repeat courses that they've already successfully completed. Doing those things tends to undermine their performance. There's a great study by Sonnert and Sadler in 2014, even at the level of pre-calculus. Across all kinds of levels of preparation in pre-calculus, repeating pre-calculus in college actually decreases students' performance in the calculus course. It does not increase it, and it makes them less likely to get there.
Wow.
So we just really have to rethink what repetition of courses successfully completed accomplishes, and whether or not we can take the types of things that we've learned within developmental education, how to support students, and more appropriately deliver that at the course that would be the next logical progression for our students.
Thank you. Finally, I have a question. Is there something you can point us to that identifies the errors you identified in A Nation at Risk? Is there something that we can Google quickly, or is there a link that you can share?
I think if you Google, probably the easiest thing to do would be to Google the Sandia report.
Sandia?
Sandia, S-A-N-D-I-A.
Okay.
I think that's the right name. So it's basically a bunch of folks, I think it was actually, it might have been from the Department of Energy, that was like, this doesn't wash. And so
Mm-hmm.
they actually went back and redid some of the analyses and found something very different. I think let me just pop out of this and see if that's the
Okay.
right
While you do
name.
that, I'm gonna show up. I'm gonna come back to being the presenter, and show a couple more slides.
Okay.
Just to wrap up our meeting today. Let me pop this back in, and I want to go to. Oh, I didn't want to do the whole thing. No. I want you to show me just these last couple of slides again. These are a couple. If you were on this morning, I showed you this slide with the big goals that we're looking at the Center for Student Success. After, and I thought this would make sense to show again after we have seen, many of you have been on all three of these webinars, to look at increasing the numbers of our students who are completing college level math and English within 1 year, and decreasing reliance on single measures such as AccuPlacer to determine readiness for college level work, because we still have a third of our colleges who are still doing that. And one of the we have in the survey that we did that we're just actually in the process of completing, 21 of the responding colleges indicated that they would be interested in joining an initiative to scale up developmental ed reform. The most popular design features so far are some on-site individualized support, institute model learning communities, such as we typically have been using with our guided pathways work, bringing people together, and modest pass-through funding to support things like release time for full-time faculty to work on these issues, or support convening or perhaps coaching on your own campus. So we will be exploring opportunities to fund this work in the next 6 to 12 months. So stay tuned to our information from the Center for Student Success, and hopefully we can bring you lots more of this type of information and bring some of these folks maybe on the ground to our state, and hopefully get Michigan moving in this direction as we begin to assimilate and think about what is happening on the edge, the cutting edge of our field of developmental education now. Is, things have changed dramatically, and we in Michigan, we have apparently 21 colleges who are interested in keeping up. So I'm happy to hear about that. All right, John, back to you if you want to have any closing comments.
Sure. Yes, it is the Sandia report. It's publicly available at JSTOR as SANDIA. And Edutopia had a pretty easy to read kind of summary of that and the consequences of it a while back. The other thing that I might recommend for folks who want to get a better sense of what's happening with young folks today and their experience with what it means to be a young student, what it means to go to college. There's a fantastic book called Kids These Days. It came out in 2017, and it really provides a very sharp and highly informed kind of pulling the curtain back of what students actually have to do. That's very different than what we had to do when we were going through high school. Sometimes I give an example from the difference between what my daughter did for her kind of key end of the year 4th grade project and what I did for the key end of the year 4th year project. So I was in a gifted and talented program, at a citywide school in Milwaukee, and we had to do a report on an animal, any animal that we loved, and we had to get real primary resources. And so this is something I was super proud of. I got like 6 different primary resources on the kit fox, a small animal that's super cute. Did a nice kind of 2 or 3 page report on it. In the end, had one of those big kind of like poster displays where, you have the paper and then you have cardboard that frames the paper really nice, and then a big poster board that's on. Got an A+. It got put in the office. It was awesome, right? I loved it. Right, that was my fourth grade project. I had to go to the library like 3 or 4 times, figure out how to navigate the card catalog, kind of figure out how to type stuff. Lots of new skills for a fourth grader. Here's my daughter's fourth grade project. She had to look up and find historical things that still existed in our home city of Fullerton here in California, and go and take a picture of herself via currently existing historical artifacts throughout the city. Then she had to put them in a timeline and create a narrative of the entire city's history across using the monuments that she found as signposts. Take that narrative, record it, create an avatar of herself so that it would basically essentially look like it was saying those words. Put that recording into a soundtrack, put the images into a video, put background music that was appropriate for the era behind it, and create a 5 to 10 minute video that then was posted on YouTube for the entire class to view. Her whole class did this in our local non-gifted and talented school that she walks to, right? So the idea that students today are not going through and developing rigorous 21st century skills in the way that we were back in our day just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And so I really recommend that you consider reading the book Kids These Days to get a better sense of what young adults today, and older adults to some extent as well, go through that was very different than our experiences with education.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for those of you who have been on all 3 of these webinars, or if you just joined for this last one, I want to wish you all a good weekend, and thank you, and look forward to working with you all in the future. And thank you, John. Thank you, Lexa, if you're on. And Peter had to jump off, but we appreciate him as well. So thank you all, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.